So I'd like to speak about my new book, Time Expansion Experiences. Maybe before I begin with the talk, let's maybe have a few minutes of meditation. This meditation will also introduce the theme of time perception and time expansion, but it will also allow us to settle into the session and to empty our minds of any peripheral detritus from earlier in the day. So let's settle down for a second and let's settle into our meditative posture. I'll begin this meditation with a short visualization to introduce the theme of letting go of the past and future and settling into the present moment. So let's just allow ourselves to settle, allow your breathing to slow down a little as you close your eyes. Just focus on your breathing for a moment. Be aware of the air entering and leaving your nose as you breathe in and out. Feel that sensation of the air brushing the inside of your nose as you breathe in and out. Now, I'd like you to create an image in your mind. I'd like you to picture yourself walking down a long, straight road into the future. Maybe you can see one or two events from the future in front of you by the side of the road. And also, you can see the long road stretching ahead of you into the future. You can also see it stretching behind you into the past, stretching as far as you can see into the past, just as it stretches in front of you as far as you can see into the future. Behind you, maybe you can see one or two events from your past by the side of the road. So again, just picture yourself walking down this long, straight road. And way off in the distance, you can see a soft grey mist emerging, beginning to move towards you slowly, beginning to cover the road in front of you, covering the events from your future, moving closer slowly until it's so close to you, you can feel the soft foaming mist against your body, touching you softly. Then it continues to foam behind you, covering the road behind you, covering the events from your past, covering the whole of your past, the whole of the road behind you, until you can see nothing but a thin, foaming mist everywhere around you. Now there's no direction ahead or behind you, only this all-consuming, foaming mist all around you. But now a light begins to break through the mist, just like dawn, as if dawn is breaking. The mist begins to dissolve away slowly. And as it does so, a natural landscape begins to emerge. You can see trees, plants, flowers, hills in the distance, the sky above you. A beautiful panoramic landscape emerging all around you. as the mist fades away and completely disappears. Again, there's no sense of direction, no future ahead of us, no past behind us. There's only this beautiful panorama stretching all around us without direction. Let's release ourselves from the future and release ourselves from the past and just open ourselves to the panorama of the present, which is the only place we can ever be. Now, bring your attention back to your breathing for a moment. Notice that your breathing is slower, a little deeper than before. And after your next out breath, slowly open your eyes again. And let's take in this present moment that we're experiencing right now. Just gently observe the room that you're sitting in, all of the objects and phenomena around you. Reminding yourself that this present moment is the only place that you can ever experience. And now let's bring that meditation to a close. Thanks, everybody. That meditation illustrates one way in which we can transcend time, which is by letting go of the future and the past and bringing ourselves purely into the present. I guess you could say that when you're purely in the present, time no longer exists. There's another way, though, of transcending time, which is by expanding the present so that it encompasses the future and the past. The present becomes not no time, but it becomes all time. All time becomes part of the present moment. We'll look into that a bit later on. But for now, just let me, I'm going to explain how this book, Time Expansion Experiences, how it came into being. In 2007, I think it was, I published another book about time. Some of you may have heard or read this book, which is called Making Time. I published that in 2007, which is 18 years ago now. And in some ways, that was my most mainstream psychology book. It was my attempt to understand why time seems to flow at different speeds in different situations. For example, when you're bored, time seems to go slowly. When you have new experiences, time seems to go slowly as well. And time seems to contract or disappear when you're intensely absorbed in an activity. I also wrote about how time appears to how our perception of time is affected by mystical experiences. I wrote about precognition, but mainly, it was quite a mainstream psychology book. And after I'd written that book, I thought I kind of I thought, well, I've dealt with the topic of time now. I'll look into other areas. I'll move on from time. And I thought that I didn't expect to address the topic of time again in a book. But 10 years ago, I had a car crash. I was driving on the M60 motorway just outside Manchester, and I was with my wife in the car. We were on the inside lane. Sorry, we were in the middle lane of the motorway, and there was a truck on the inside lane which didn't see us and tried to move into the middle lane. So the driver clipped the back of our car, which immediately started to spin round. He clipped us again, so we started to spin round even faster. But as soon as I heard the noise of the truck clipping our car, everything shifted. I went into an altered state of consciousness. And I remember saying to my wife, there was like a booming noise, a boom noise. And I said to my wife, there seemed to be a long pause. And I said to my wife, what was that noise? Then there seemed to be another long pause. And then the car started spinning as if we were on the waltzers at the fairground. So my perception became very clear. I could see the frightened faces of the drivers behind us. I could see the long lines of cars stretching way behind us on the motorway. It was quite a busy motorway. But I felt this strange sense of calmness. I had no sense of fear. I did think to myself, this is a very dangerous situation. We're probably going to get injured. We could even be killed. But I was very rational and very calm. Even I felt a strange sense of well-being. So I thought very methodically about how to deal with the situation. I tried to shift the car, shift the steering wheel to the left, tried the handbrake, all the time thinking very methodically about the situation. But luckily, and maybe it was because of maybe because I tried to shift the car to the left. But luckily, we span in the direction of the hard shoulder. We crashed into a barrier. And at that moment, when we crashed into the barrier, everything went back into a normal state of consciousness. Time seemed to resume its normal speed. So the whole incident probably lasted no longer than 3 or 4 seconds. But in my mind, it was much longer. It seemed to stretch out to maybe 45 seconds. I felt as I had so much time to perceive the situation, to contemplate the situation, to try to take some preventative action. And luckily I remember looking over at my wife and I thought, wow, she's not injured at all. She looks fine. Then I looked at my own body and I thought, wow, I seem to be fine too. My legs are still there. I seem to be in one piece. So we were completely fine, even though the car was written off. It had to be scrapped. And there was a nice outcome because the truck driver was really upset that he'd caused the accident. And he was, quite traumatized by it because he'd watched the car spin round. So we hugged him before we left, after we exchanged all the insurance details and the police came and everything. So it was a good outcome. But for me as a psychologist and researcher of altered states of consciousness, it made me reconsider the topic of time, and I began to research what I called time expansion experiences. I began to collect reports of them, and I began to analyze time expansion experiences. And I found that they didn't just occur in accidents, they also occur in states such as under the influence of psychedelics. They sometimes occur in sport. They sometimes occur in deep meditation or in powerful moments of presence, particularly when a person feels intensely connected to nature or intensely connected to another human being. Time seems to freeze or stand still. So initially I collected around 100 reports of time expansion experiences. And as I say, I analyzed them to find out the situations when they occur, and also to find out the characteristics of time expansion experiences. I'll just share a slide briefly to show you what I found from my research initially. Where is my slide? Oh yeah, here it is. So this is from a paper I published in a journal about 4 years ago. This was an analysis of 74 time expansion experiences. And you can see that most of them took place in accidents and emergencies, 40 out of 74. Not just car accidents, but falls, health emergencies, violent attacks. There were many cases of falls from Well, ranging from people who fell off the side of mountains, climbers who fell from the side of a mountain, ranging all the way down to a person who fell while they were walking on the pavement and they fell to the ground. And in that space of maybe half a second, they felt time expand so that they were able to position themselves to minimize the danger, to minimize injury. So the second most common source of time expansion was what you could call spiritual states, meditation, mindfulness, presence. Then psychedelics, which you could include, if you wanted, you could include that in spiritual states. And then sports and games. And these were, in the next slide, these are some of the characteristics I found of the experiences. The most striking aspect of the experiences was that almost everybody reported feeling a sense of well-being, even if their life was in danger, or even if they were facing serious injury, they felt incredibly calm and peaceful with a sense of detachment, as if they weren't really concerned. Well, maybe not concerned is the wrong word, but they felt such a sense of well-being that it didn't really worry them that they may be about to face injury. So in that sense, they were essentially spiritual experiences, moments of deep well-being. Sometimes people reported feelings of oneness, feeling connected to the nature around them, feeling connected to the other human beings. And as I say, even if it was an accident situation, there was still that sense of connection. Many people reported a sense, again, this is another characteristic of spiritual experiences, a sense of heightened awareness, sense of deep presence, clarity. People gave me really beautiful descriptions. Even in car accidents, which are usually quite brutal and violent, people described the scene with, in a very poetic way. One person described how the windscreen of his car shattered, and he saw these tiny shards of glass floating above him in the sunshine, reflecting the sunlight, like diamonds shining in the sunlight. So that was a pretty typical description. There was also a lot of variety in the kind of time expansion that people reported. For many people, it was a sense that 3 or 4 seconds turned into something like a minute. But for other people, it was more radical. A few seconds could turn into hours. That was particularly the case with psychedelics. I'm not sure how many of you have tried psychedelics, but psychedelics are well known for their time expanding effects. And in my research, some people reported a few seconds or maybe a few minutes seeming like hours when they were in, an altered state of consciousness due to psychedelics. Most people in accidents felt that they had the chance to take some preventative action. A lot of people were convinced that the action they took because of the time expansion saved their lives, because they were able to do more, they had more opportunity to take evasive action or to try to ward off danger. And that's important because that proves that these are real experiences. When people have the opportunity to do more and think more within a short period of time, it proves that they are experiencing that short period of time as much longer than they would normally do. And many people reported a sense of quietness too, as if all external sounds had disappeared. Let me just give you a couple of examples from my research. This is a very simple example of a woman who fell off a horse. And obviously, if you fall off a horse, it takes maybe 2 seconds at the most to hit the ground, maybe 1 second to hit the ground. But for her, it seemed to last for minutes. She said, the whole experience seemed to last for minutes. I was ultra calm, unconcerned that the horse still hadn't recovered its balance and quite possibly could fall on top of me. My thoughts were only, I wonder where the horse is. And because she was able to position herself, because she had the extra time to position herself in such a way that she would minimize injury, she wasn't seriously injured by the fall. The second one is a more dramatic example from an American woman who she was heavily pregnant, about 7 months pregnant at the time, and her house, two burglars tried to break into her house. She heard them outside. She had a replica gun, so she went onto the balcony of her house and pointed the replica gun at the burglars to try to frighten them. But unfortunately, they had a real gun and they shot at her four times, I think. And she said it was the space, it happened in the space of 2 seconds. But this is how she described those 2 seconds. The night before, there was a movie on TV with a policeman who throws himself to the ground to avoid being shot. I remembered it and decided I should do the same. I turned around and everything slowed down enough for me to think, I have to get to the ground, but I have to fall in such a way as not to damage the baby in my belly. I saved myself and my baby. The four shots probably happened over 2 seconds, but it felt like about 15 seconds to me. Time totally slowed down and allowed me to think. This is a real example of what's sometimes called bullet time. I guess some of you have probably seen the Matrix films, and you remember those scenes from the films where bullets fly in incredible slow motion, giving more people more time to giving people time to avoid the bullets. So in the end, this can be a real phenomenon. But another thing I found in my research was that people didn't just report time expansion. Some people reported what I called time cessation. So in other words, time didn't just slow down, it actually stopped. It's a bit like, if you imagine a train, if you imagine the driver of a train pulls the brake and the train slows down gradually, and eventually it comes to a halt. So it's the same thing. Time can expand so much that it comes to a halt. But time cessation experiences are not as common. In fact, they're nowhere near as common as TEEs. I found that around 75% of people out of the general population have had at least one time expansion experience. But TCEs are much, much rarer. They actually only happen in two situations. They happen in intense mystical experiences. And this is why in mystical literature, you find the phrase the eternal moment or the timeless moment or the eternal now. Because, in intense mystical experiences, time disappears. We reach a deep state of consciousness where time simply does not exist. Or time cessation can happen in near-death experiences, when a person dies for a few seconds or a few minutes before they are resuscitated. But it's important to point out that time cessation experiences can occur in two forms. And this relates back to the meditation at the beginning of this session. Time cessation experiences can be no time, when time just disappears, as in the timeless moment. Or they can be all time, when the present and the future and the past all coincide. The future and the past become part of the present. I'll just show you one more slide with an example of that. Maybe some of you have heard of a guy called David Ditchfield, who I've interviewed a couple of times, and he had a near-death experience when he was stepping off a train after saying goodbye to his friend, and his coat was caught in the closing doors of the train, and he couldn't release his coat. He couldn't take his coat off. And so as the train set off, he was pulled along the platform. He described himself as bouncing like a rag doll along the platform. He was pulled along the train pulled underneath the train as it picked up speed. So one aspect of his experience was that he experienced massive time expansion while he was under the train. But another aspect was that because he was badly injured and losing a lot of blood, he apparently died briefly while paramedics were taking him to hospital. And he had a near-death experience. And then the experience was so complex and detailed that he spends a whole book basically describing the experience. But he didn't really feel as though time was a factor in his experience because well, this is how he described it. He said, I stepped out of the flow of time completely. In this expanded existence, the notion of time simply didn't exist. On the contrary, you've probably heard about Anita Mojani's uh, well-known near-death experience. She had an experience of all time in which in which the future and the past coincided with the present. This is how she described it. She said, time didn't run linearly the way we experience it here. It's as though our earthly minds convert what happens around us into a sequence. But in actuality, when we're not expressing to our bodies, everything occurs simultaneously, whether past, present, or future. That's why in many near-death experiences, people have precognitive visions. They sometimes see events from their own lives, or sometimes global events. Sometimes they feel that they have a choice whether they can return to their bodies or remain in this place of peace in another reality. And if they are told that if they return to their bodies, certain events will occur in their lives. They're sometimes shown the events that will occur. And as I'm sure you know, many near-death experiences include a life review in which a person literally relives a whole lifetime of events in the space of a few seconds. So precognition and the life review are only possible if time becomes panoramic, if the future and the past become part of the present. Or maybe the best way to explain it is that our awareness expands beyond the present to take in the future and the past. A bit like a person at the peak of a mountain who surveys a whole landscape, panoramically stretching around them. So let me stop sharing my slides for a moment. It would be good to know, actually. Maybe can I just ask you a question? There are around 30 of us in the session. Maybe you could just write yes or no in the chat box. Have you ever had a time expansion experience of the kind that I've described so far? You can either raise your hand or just type yes in the chat box. Great. So most people are typing yes. Only one no so far. Great. Maybe you can just let me know, did it occur in an accident or in a spiritual context? Maybe you can just write accident or spiritual. Or if it's another context, you could write that too. A few people writing both. After massive surgery. 4 examples. Wow. Martial arts. That's interesting. Personal trauma, car crash. Right. So yeah, a combination of mostly accidents or spiritual experiences. Martial arts is interesting because what the final chapter of the book deals with the question of whether we can consciously control our experience of time, whether we can induce time expansion experiences consciously. And I believe we can do that. Certainly to an extent, I believe that we can induce time expansion. I refer to the example of athletes and sports people. There are many athletes who feel that they can slow down time in pivotal moments of the game or before they hit the ball. And I think there are some athletes who, I think maybe the very greatest athletes or sports people do have the ability to slip into an altered state of consciousness in which time slows down or even disappears. There's been a lot of discussion about Lionel Messi, the footballer, who a lot of people believe is the best football player in the world, even now when I think he's 37 years old now. And people have speculated that he moves so gracefully. Everything seems to be so easy and so slow for him. He seems to just operate on a different level to his opponents. So I believe that he has a different experience of time than in his mind, in his consciousness, time seems to move more slowly. And in martial arts, I know that there are some practices where people do try to slow down time. They try to cultivate a state of no mind or empty mind or machine in which time slows down. And obviously, if you are a sports person, that gives you a massive advantage. And I think meditation, you know, can play a similar role. I mean, we're essentially talking about meditation. There's actually some research which I refer to in the book showing that people who have meditated for a long time, for decades, regularly experience a slower passage of time than other people. So I think meditation, regular meditation, may be the key to slowing down time. And more generally, living in a state of conscious awareness, living in a state of openness and mindfulness can slow down time. But let me just end with a couple of general reflections um, about what all of this means. And thanks, by the way, for these reflections and these comments and this information. If any of you would like to, um, write a more detailed report of your time expansion experience, I'd love to receive it if you have the time. I'll just actually write down my email address. You could send it direct to my email address if you like. That's my email address. Or you could simply write it now in the chat box if it's no more than a couple of sentences. But it's amazing actually, since the book was published, it was only published 2 months ago. And over the past 2 or 3 weeks, it started to generate some publicity. There have been a few news stories about it. So a lot of people, almost every day, several people have been writing to me to share their time expansion experiences. And a lot of people have been saying, wow, until I read, I had no idea that time expansion was a thing. And I've never told anybody about this experience because I thought people would think I was crazy. Or maybe I did try to tell somebody about it, but they thought I was crazy. So yes, it's great to feel that people are opening up about these experiences. I think there's still a bit of taboo about anomalous experiences, spiritual experiences. People are afraid of not being taken seriously or others thinking that they're crazy. But what does all this mean? Well, what I think it means is that ultimately, at the ground level of reality, time doesn't really exist. In my view, time is created by the ego. It's created by our normal sense of identity, our normal psychological processes. And there's one particular aspect of our normal identity which creates time or creates our normal awareness of time. And that is our normal self boundary. It's normal for human beings to experience a sense of separateness to the world. We feel that we're living in here, inside our own mental space, inside our bodies. And the rest of the world is out there on the other side. Other people are out there. We're essentially alone living inside this separate state of being. And I think that sense of separateness creates a normal sense of fast moving linear time. And the reason why I think that is because whenever this self boundary becomes softer, or whenever it disappears or dissolves away, then time dissolves away too. In all time expansion experiences, there is an altered state of consciousness in which boundaries begin to soften or fade away. Accidents and emergencies shift us into an altered state of consciousness. Obviously, psychedelics or meditation and other context shift us into altered states of consciousness. And at the very highest level, when our boundaries fade away completely, which happens in intense mystical experiences and in near-death experiences, then time disappears completely too. These are the moments of no time or of all time. So there's a very strong link between our self boundary and our sense of time. So that when our boundaries fade away, our sense of time fades away. And that is the key to us consciously inducing time expansion or time cessation. It's about softening or transcending our ego boundaries. So that's why meditation is an effective way of transcending time. And there are lots of other ways too, like connection with nature is a great way of softening ego boundaries. Altruism is a great way of softening ego boundaries because it transcends selfishness and connects us with other human beings. So yeah, I guess the final point I'd like you to take away is that time is kind of illusory. At the foundation level of the universe, at the ground level of reality, time doesn't really exist. And that means that we don't have to feel oppressed by time. We don't have to feel that time is running away from us, that we don't have enough time. Because, why would you feel oppressed by an illusion? There's nothing there to ultimately feel oppressed by. So I think just that realization gives us a sense of liberation, a sense of freedom from time. And it certainly has for me anyway. That's my own, the effect that researching and writing the book has had on me is to, make me more detached from time, make me feel less oppressed by time. With the awareness that even if I am living in time in my practical day-to-day life, there is this ocean of timelessness to my side, almost as if I'm walking along the beach in a straight line, but I can sense this ocean of timelessness beside me. And I can step into the ocean of timelessness too. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation. I have actually, yeah. There is a study, not me, but there was a psychologist called Ruth Ogden who studied that, and she found that people had different experiences. She found that people who were more isolated and maybe they were living alone without family around them, they experienced a slower passage of time during the lockdown. But others who were in a bubble with other people, um, who had a more social experience, they experienced a quicker speed of time. So it seemed to be related to the degree of isolation. Yeah, I mean, precognition, it does suggest that free will is either non-existent or limited. The block universe theory, which suggests that the future exists alongside the present. If the future already exists, then our lives are in some sense predetermined, because the future is fixed. We are inevitably drawn towards future events which have already happened. But I think it's more nuanced than that. I think in reality, we do have a degree of free will. And in fact, near-death experiences are evidence of that because sometimes people are shown the lives that will unfold if they return to their bodies. But it's the if they return to their bodies, they have the choice about whether to go back to their bodies or not. So if they don't decide to return to their bodies, then that future will not manifest itself. And also, there are lots of precognitive experiences. It's quite common for people to see themselves having accidents. There's an example I quote in the book of I think it was an 8-year-old boy who had a dream in which he crashed into a tree on his bike. So he had the dream, and 2 days later, he was on his bike and he saw the tree in front of him. So obviously he steered away from the tree, so the accident didn't happen. So again, that suggests that it's not predetermined, because he had the choice about whether to veer away. He had the opportunity to veer away from the tree. So the his precognitive vision was not completely accurate. So I think we're talking about not about a future which is fixed, but I think we're talking about probabilities and potentialities. So there is some degree of variation, which fits with quantum physics too. In the quantum world, everything is about potential and probability. Nothing is fixed until it actually occurs. Yeah, yeah. That reminds me of the teachings of Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff. The idea that human beings are basically robots. You're a robot. You have no choice but to follow your conditioning and to follow the pattern, the set pattern for your future. But if you start to wake up, then you start to have a degree of free will, and you can, create your own life to some degree. On quite a basic mundane level, it's quite easy to stretch your experience of time. Um, and you can do it through new experience. Uh, I have this analogy that I use in the book where I talk about two twins. There's one twin who leaves school and gets a job in her hometown, and she spends like 40 years doing the same job in for the same company. And she travels 2 weeks a year on a holiday. The rest of the time she lives in the home environment, doing the same thing day after day after day. But her twin leaves school and goes traveling around the world. She spends a couple of years in Australia. She does various jobs in various countries, has a really amazingly rich, adventurous life. Assuming those two twins die on the same day, the second twin will actually live for a lot longer. She will actually experience a lot more time in her life than the first twin because she's had so much new experience in her life. New experience stretches time. And that's because there's a relationship between information processing and time. The more information we process, the more time is stretched, which is why, any, any trip to a foreign environment, any degree of unfamiliarity seems to stretch time. So that's one simple way. But even more fundamentally, you can stretch time through conscious awareness, through being mindful of your experience. You don't have to travel to a different country to get new experience. You can get new experience in your home environment just by being consciously aware of where you are and what you're doing. But ultimately, I think the most effective way of expanding time is to enter, a state of deep meditation. Deep meditation can expand time in the moment, but it also can have a cumulative effect where, your normal ongoing sense of time becomes expanded. I touched on this at the end of my talk. To a certain extent, time is about duration, and duration applies to processes. So processes always have a certain duration. Our life in this body, in this form, has a certain duration. The Earth turning on its axis and rotating around the sun has a certain duration. This is the familiar world of processes and duration which we live in. But I agree in the sense that that duration these processes take place against a background of timelessness. Just like, yeah, I love that analogy of waves on the surface of the ocean. But as I said at the end of the talk, we to a certain extent we have to abide by the processes of the world in which we live. We experience those processes, including the process of our own life. We are caught up in that duration. But even while we are experiencing duration, we can be aware of the fundamental timelessness of the world. Like, as we walk along the beach in a straight line, we can sense the ocean next to us, and we can actually walk in the ocean as we walk in a straight line. We can live in timelessness as well as living in time. Hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I was reading an article today about some research with athletes, and some athletes describe, the moment, for example, the moment before they hit the ball, like a baseball player, for example, or a tennis player. They describe it in similar terms that they become so mindful and so focused, so alert that they're just aware of so much more in that moment. And because of that hyper alertness, time seems to expand and they feel that they have more time to position themselves and more time to direct the ball in the right place. I think the evolution of consciousness is about expanding awareness. I say this in some of my other books, like The Leap, for example, how, right from the beginning of evolution, living beings have become physically more complex and more varied. And at the same time, they've become more conscious, they become more sentient, they've developed a more expansive inner being. And that, I think animals like human beings, I don't think we're necessarily the most conscious. I think animals like dolphins and whales are probably at least as conscious, if not more conscious than we are. But we're certainly, at the kind of at the forefront of the evolutionary process in that sense. And I think these experiences of timelessness, they're a kind of glimpse of an even further, an even greater progression in evolution. They're a glimpse of an even higher state of consciousness. I think it's really interesting that timelessness is always connected to transcending separateness. Time and space are always interconnected. This is what Einstein said, time and space are interconnected. And it applies to all of these experiences. In every time expansion experience, there's also a different spatial experience. People often report feeling that they're outside their bodies. They report feeling that they're no longer separate to their surroundings, to other people or other living beings. So yeah, it's part of the same process. It's part of the unfolding and the expansion of consciousness. Yeah, well, yeah, that's a beautiful way of describing it. Yeah, I think it's about breaking down the barriers between the past, present, and the future, and it fits very well with quantum physics. I speak about this in the book about the phenomenon of retrocausation, which is when the future affects the present and the present affects the past. And it's a very real phenomenon in quantum physics. So waves can travel backwards in time, and what happens in the present can actually affect past events. It can change past events, and so yeah, we're dealing with this fundamental timelessness, the ground level of the universe when there is no division between past, present, and future. It's all part of one panorama. So yeah, in that sense, in that way, it makes perfect sense what you were describing. It's a lot more common. I know those experiences are really common, but I think people sometimes kind of don't realize that it's an experience of retrocognition. They think it's maybe just ordinary memory, so they don't really pay much attention to it. Yeah, definitely. TEEs are definitely a form of super consciousness. That's a good way of describing them. Moving from you got the subconscious, the conscious, and the superconscious. So we're definitely tapping into the superconscious in these experiences. And it's interesting that there are some stories of people. A lot of people, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people say that because time expanded, they were able to take life-saving action. For example, one woman described how she was able to save three of her children from a fire because time slowed down. She was able to run in and take them out one by one while they were asleep. Young children, babies and toddlers. But also some cases where people felt that they were able to physically do things that were normally impossible, lift things or carry things or lift the wheel of a car away from their limbs. So yeah, again, it's tapping into the superconscious. Well, well, on a quantum level, that happens when waves from the past, sorry, from the present, travel back into the past, and they can eliminate patterns of past events, and so that only one particular pattern remains. So you know that's a very real phenomenon. So it does suggest that the past can change the present. Sorry, the present can change the past. I love that. I haven't heard of that, but it makes a lot of sense. I'll definitely look into that because I know from not so much in this book, but in Making Time, I wrote a lot about Indigenous people's perception of time. And to many Indigenous peoples, it is as if the past is still real. The spirits of their ancestors live amongst them, interacting with them. And many Indigenous peoples also, they don't seem to have a concept. Some of them don't seem to have a concept of the future. They're so present centered that the future doesn't really exist. Yeah, so there is something about, the colonial enterprise of, dividing hours into minutes, projecting a future. There is definitely something colonial about that. It's something about, the pagan worldview is very cyclical. But, when Christianity came over and kind of supplanted paganism, it tried to impose a more linear view of time. I mean, the fundamental idea of Christianity is that the world was created by God at one point in time and it will end at a certain point in time. So everything between those 2 points is a straight line, like an arrow of time. I mean, it could just be the generation of a false memory, a false collective memory that becomes a kind of meme. Or in theory, I'm open to the idea that in theory, you know, this is a bit like what we were talking about earlier, retrocausation. In theory, I think the present could affect the past. I think people's mental patterns and mental intentions now could potentially change past events and alter the course of history. But in the big, I guess the important phrase is in theory. I'm not sure whether it could happen in reality. Yeah, that makes sense. It's the idea of, again, it's the idea of returning to the past, correcting or changing the past. And again, I think that's definitely possible. I think that may be a form of retrocognition, you know, when you actually do return to prior events in your life and re-experience them, relive them. And, that can be a life-changing experience. It can help you to transcend the trauma that you experienced at the time. The best place is my website. I've just typed it into the box, stephenmtaylor.com, Stephen with a V, M for Mark. So you'll find information about my latest activities, talks, and my social media accounts and so forth at that website. Well, I'm not really working in time because time is an illusion. I've transcended time. No, I am working. I've just completed a book of poetry. I don't know if you know, but I've published three previous books of poetry. So I'm just pondering over which publisher to approach with my new book of poetry. Poetry is quite, as you probably know, it's quite specialist. Not many publishers deal with poetry. So that's what I'm up to at the moment. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye bye.
Thank you. All the best. Bye bye.